a book about the neighborhood of Forest Hills in Queens, which is not that far away from here. It's a neighborhood where I grew up, where I still live. And there's a whole series of books called Images of America. And they have different neighborhoods in New York City, throughout the country. And it just so happens that I did the one about my neighborhood. There's actually one that's going to be coming out soon on Jackson Heights, which is where I'm sure many of you live. And I don't know if there's one on Sunnyside, but there are a lot of them on neighborhoods where you might live throughout the city or the country, where you're originally from or whatever. But so you're supposed to, in this series, you pick different images that kind of display the best of the neighborhood, its entire history, and that's what I tried to do here. So I focused a lot on the early history of this neighborhood, how it came to be in the early, well, I guess mid to late 1800s into the modern day. So there are photos from different archives, libraries, different people who I met who just gave me photos from their attic or basement, and that made up everything in this book. And I guess I'll talk about a few of the highlights that Sahadav mentioned, and I'll do it kind of briskly because I'm not sure how interested you are in any of this since you're not necessarily from the neighborhood. All my other previous talks have been with people who live in Forest Hills, so they're maybe really intensely interested. But anyhow, the image on the cover that you see here shows President Teddy Roosevelt, you might be familiar with. He was President of the United States in the early 1900s, and he was the only president of the United States that was born in a major city. He was born in New York. And his birthplace is actually a museum right now in Manhattan that you could go to. But in 1917, when the United States was in World War I, he came to speak in Forest Hills at the Forest Hills train station, the Long Island Railroad station, which still exists today. And in the introduction to this book, I go into his entire speech, the reason why he came here, the fact that he thought the United States should have entered World War I a lot sooner than it did, because it kind of stayed pacifist and isolationist for a while. So just the whole circumstance surrounding why he came to Forest Hills at that time and how that led to Forest Hills gaining in popularity, appeal, having a lot of elite residents come into that neighborhood. Forest Hills also hosted for a long time the US Open tennis tournament that's now in Flushing Meadows. So it used to be for a number of years out of Forest Hills, which is one of the reasons why Roosevelt showed there, because he was a big tennis fan. So that's why he decided to show up, probably one of the many reasons. But other highlights throughout the book, the foreword of this book was written by Ray Romano, who you might have heard of from Everybody Loves Raymond, the TV show. It's still on TV all the time. So Ray Romano actually grew up in Forest Hills and lived there for really a long time. He lived with his mom until he was in like his late 20s, early 30s in Forest Hills. So he has great memories that he discusses in the book about selling Christmas trees at a parking lot in Forest Hills and working in a bunch of different bars and a movie theater in Forest Hills and just going to school there. He did his first ever comedy routine in the basement of the church that I go to in Forest Hills. So he gives a little forward introduction about how it impacted him, which is kind of fun. Some other things that you might have heard of from pop culture in the book, I include a photo of the house in Forest Hills where Helen Keller lived. Like Sahadav mentioned, Helen Keller, a very famous blind and deaf advocate, and a lot of people don't know that for 20 years, actually about 21 years, she lived in Forest Hills, 1917 to 1938, right before she died a few years after she moved out. But there's a photo in here of her house, which doesn't exist anymore. Fortunately, it was demolished in the 1960s for a synagogue. And now there's a synagogue on that spot, and there's a little plaque on the wall that says, Helen Keller lived here once. But most of the book really focuses not so much on the famous people who were there, but just the development of the neighborhood of Forest Hills Gardens, which was an elite garden community at a time when a lot of this city was tenements and really crowded little apartments that were dirty in Manhattan. They decided to build this neighborhood that would be a model utopia kind of community where you'd have access to green space and air and recreation and just huge homes that now cost multi-million-dollar fees, and it still exists pretty much the way that it originally was built in the early 1900s, which is rare in Queens. Like a lot of this area, as you might have noticed, has been developed pretty recently, or there's an older building and then they demolish it and put up something else. But Forest Hills is one of the few places where you can see a lot of buildings that are still left from 1901, 1902. A lot of that stuff is still there.
with the exception of the Helen Keller house, but that's a rare exception here.